Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are most welcome here. And today is going to be the first video in a series of videos in which I create a Big Thunder Mountain inspired Christmas tree. So today we're going to make something related to the lighting of the tree. Let's go have some fun.
So I want to make little kerosene lanterns, such as what you might find in a mine. And what can you use to make little kerosene lanterns? Well, what I have here is some finger shooters, which are sort of like tiny little foam noodles. I have some craft foam. I have some flip-flops, and I was really excited to find these little glass jars because that was the part that I was most worried about, is what would I use for the glass part of the lantern. Now, these finger shooters have these wings on them, and when I took them off, I realized that these little pieces of foam would probably be perfect for those side pieces on a lantern. You could, of course, just use any regular craft foam if you didn't have enough of these, or if you don't have the finger shooters. So the finger shooters are basically the perfect size for the little glass jar to fit inside. So if you just cut off a slice of the finger shooter, you can stick the little glass jar inside. Now, the very first lantern that I make mostly from the finger shooter. So I cut off one piece of the finger shooter for the bottom to insert the glass into, and one piece for the top, but I wanted the top to be a little bit smaller, so I decided to sort of squish it together and glue it with hot glue. I'm working from a kerosene lamp that I found in my home, and I have no idea where this thing came from. It started out purple, but I thought that it would be a great decor piece to go with this tree, so I painted it a sort of oil-rubbed bronze by painting it black, and then dabbing on a sort of a bronze color of paint. Now I'm working from that as sort of a model. I'm not going to make, obviously, a tiny little replica of it, but I'm trying to get as close as I can. So I'm going to use a compass to make circles for some of the larger pieces, like so for the base, for below that finger shooter piece, and then between top pieces. So just sort of estimating with a compass a good size for that, and then tracing it on the piece of craft foam and cutting it out. Now, unfortunately, I could only get a thin piece of craft foam. My local Joann's is going to be closing down and opening up a store in another location, so they haven't been restocking, at least that's what they told me, and they didn't have any thick craft foam, but I thought I could make do with the thin craft foam here. In fact, I decided this would be the perfect application for the flip-flop. So instead of using a nice thick craft foam, I'm using the flip-flop as thick craft foam. And I'm really not sure what the flip-flop is made out of as compared with craft foam. It seems to be, a little bit more rubbery than craft foam, so I'm sure it's not exactly the same material. So I cut a round piece out of the craft foam to build up the base, and I just used a box cutter knife for that. It doesn't cut super neatly, but it is relatively easy to cut with the box cutter knife, and you can also sort of finish that off with scissors. I tried to sort of bevel it with scissors once I had cut it with the knife, but if you keep watching, you'll see I found a much better technique for cutting this. So what I have is a disc of craft foam at the bottom, and then a disc of flip-flop, and then a disc, you would say, but it's, fairly thick, of the finger shooter, which I can insert the glass jar into. And then on top of that, I have another piece of the finger shooter, which is rolled up and hot glued together to make it a little bit smaller. And around that, sort of bisecting it in the middle, I've put another very thin piece of finger shooter, so that makes it look almost like it has a little hat. And all of this will hot glue together very nicely. One thing to be cautious of with the hot glue is the finger shooter, which is made of some kind of foam, which is sort of like pool noodle foam, will melt if you put the hot glue gun on it directly, or perhaps if your hot glue is very hot. I'm using a low temperature hot glue gun, so I was able to use that where I wanted to use it, but as long as I kept it far enough away from the foam, I could just plain glue it by dropping glue onto it. Now, using the little wings, I sort of measured just by holding them against my faux lantern here. Put the glass in when you're doing this, of course. I figured out sort of where I wanted it to attach, and then just cut it out, cut out the middle of it, and made a sort of a handle for each side. And now when I'm gluing the handles on, this is when I took advantage of the hot glue gun's ability to eat into the foam. So I wanted those to not be stuck on the outside because I was afraid that wouldn't be strong enough. So I did eat into the foam a little bit by just pressing the hot glue gun against it and then filling that with hot glue, and then I could insert that handle into the foam. Now, with it mostly assembled, everything except the handles attached to the top, I decided to paint it, and of course you're going to take the glass out to do this. We do want to make sure that the parts of it that will be visible through the glass, so the little inner parts, are also painted. And I'm going to paint this using an effect that will make it look like galvanized steel. I didn't want to paint them black because I was afraid that wouldn't show up well against a Christmas tree. But you could, of course, paint it any color you like. You could paint it copper or black, or you could paint it a brighter color. I wanted to go for that sort of Old West, sort of mine look. So I'm starting by painting the whole thing a shade of gray. And I'm just using apple barrel acrylic paints here in white and black and mixing up a gray color to give it a first coat of gray. With this painting technique, you're going to paint all of the surfaces gray and let that gray paint dry. And you can see that all of the surfaces take the acrylic paint pretty well. The surface that's the hardest to paint is that finger shooter, which is like the foam noodle foam. It is quite absorbent and it maintains its texture. Now, once that coat of gray paint has dried completely, we're going to do the technique to make it look like galvanized steel or galvanized tin, and to do that I'm going to use again the apple barrel acrylic black paint, and I'm also going to use a metallic silver paint. Now, the one that I have here that I've used before with good success is called metallic pewter, and it's by Handmade Modern, and I think I may have gotten it at Target, but I'm not sure. And what you're going to do is dry brush these on, and you're going to begin with the metallic silver color, so in this case metallic pewter, and then you're going to do the black, and then you're going to finish with the metallic pewter. And you can do this while they're still wet. Because you're dry brushing them, they're not going to be super wet, but you don't have to wait for the coats to dry. Now, I'm using one paintbrush here, but I found that this worked better, that I got a less muddy result if I used two paintbrushes, one for each color, and I was fairly careful not to mix the paints as best as I could. I also found, very near to the end of this entire project, that this technique seems to look better if you brush more than dab. So I'm doing it almost like I'm stenciling here by dabbing, but I found that just sort of lightly brushing and really dry brushing, getting a lot of the paint off the brush before you do this. But brushing it more than dabbing it seemed to give a result that looked more like galvanized tin or steel to me. And if you look at galvanized tin or steel, you can see that it's sort of patchy looking, not dotty looking. So I think this makes sense that you want to brush it. And now with that all dry, I used this black florist wire that I bought at the Dollar Tree to make a little hanger, and I pushed that through the top of the piece. I then inserted the glass jar and I glued the handles to the top. Now I wanted to do something for the wire that goes across the glass part of the lantern. So the little cage that encloses the glass, I imagine, to help protect it, but I'm not sure exactly, maybe to hold it in place. And the wire was really too thin. That's a very thin gauge wire. So I thought I would try this black twine from the Dollar Tree. And we're going to call this prototype number, it's actually prototype number 2 of the lanterns. At the very end, I'll show you prototype number 1, which was pretty much a complete disaster. But this is not what I ended up using in the end, but you can look at it and see what you think of this. Maybe a silver color or a white color would look better than this black color. I think the black is just too black, but otherwise I don't think it would be too bad to use twine for this. And so I basically just put that on in an X pattern and just held it with a little bit of hot glue at the top and the bottom. And again, we're going to call that prototype 2, and this is what it looks like. And I don't love it, but it's close enough that I think, okay, if I keep going but make a few modifications, I think we can come up with a lantern that's going to look pretty authentic. So for my second attempt, or third, depending on how you count them, I first watched a YouTube video on how to cut craft foam, and this video, I will link it in the description below. This video is by a cosplayer, and cosplayers really know how to work with craft foam. I've actually used it myself. I made a Zelda costume once, not for myself, for somebody else, and craft foam was wonderful for making the armor, and it looks really cool. So cosplayers really know how to work with craft foam. And what I learned was, first of all, have a very sharp knife. So what I did was I didn't actually have to replace my blade, I just had to turn it around on the knife. And then you can cut at a bevel, but what I need to do is actually make the cut at an angle with the knife. So I did that. So you can see I have a nice beveled piece of flip-flop here, but it's very, very messy. So the other thing, the third thing that I learned from the cosplayer is that you can use a Dremel to clean off the edges. And I don't know why that didn't occur to me, but I'm very glad I watched the video. So I did take this outside with a respirator on, and that is what the cosplayer suggested in the video. And I'm always in favor of being as safe as possible. So I did take it outside with a respirator and I sanded the edges. So with the Dremel, I had it on the very lowest speed, and I tried both sort of going in the same direction that the Dremel was spinning and going against the direction that the Dremel was spinning. I didn't find that either of those worked particularly better than the other, but what I would say is you want to be very careful to touch it only very lightly to your flip-flop and just go very, very slowly, just a little bit at a time, because if you try to get aggressive, you might accidentally push a little too hard and make a sort of a divot, and you don't want that. Now, just to see if it worked, I also brought out a piece of the finger shooter, which again is sort of like pool noodle foam, and that does not sand well with the Dremel at all, so you're going to have to rely on scissors, I think, to shape the pool noodle foam. So continuing with the new version of the foam lantern, it has a slightly different structure from the one that I created before. So with this one, I have a ring of foam, and then on top of that, I have the beveled flip-flop. And then on top of that, I have a piece of the finger shooter. And sometimes the finger shooter inside hole is very small, sometimes it's larger. You can just trim out the inside of that to make the hole big enough to insert the glass jar in. To soften the seam between the piece of foam on the bottom and the flip-flop, and then also between the flip-flop and the piece of finger shooter, what I did was I used that twine and just glued it right in the seam. It gives another little bump there, so I think it gives it more shape, it makes it seem a little more realistic, and it helps soften, as I said, that seam between the two pieces. So it doesn't have to be the black twine, it can be any piece of string or twine, but gluing that around, I feel, made a really big difference in this lantern. Now on the top, instead of using the finger shooter like I had used before, I used just craft foam. So I cut thin strips of craft foam and just made them into a circle by attaching the ends, and I just used hot glue for that. And then to make it look like a little hat, to have that sort of piece that bisected it before, I just cut a circle out of the craft foam and put that between the two little tubes. Now, I did try to use super glue instead of hot glue because I had seen another video which said that you could connect craft foam with super glue. I wasn't able to do it. I feel like if you could do it, it would potentially be neater than the hot glue because it is hard to make a very thin bead of hot glue, but I wasn't able to get that to work. But if you can use super glue, then certainly use the super glue. I think it would be neater. Now I also tried to cut a little hole in the top piece because my model kerosene lantern that I'm using has holes in the top pieces, I imagine, to let smoke out or whatever. So I did try cutting a little hole in this, and that definitely would have been easier when the piece was flat. That would have been the time to do that. And again, I cut the wings as before, and I cut them so that they would connect from the finger shooter piece up to the top lantern piece, so the piece over the little hat brim circle. And again, with the foam, I did melt a little hole in the foam with the hot glue gun, and then fill it with glue and insert the little side piece, the little arm. Now, I decided that with it all assembled, but of course without the glass, I would try spraying a coat of Flex Seal on it. I just felt like the Flex Seal would keep it held together a little bit better, so I thought I would try it. I also added a little bit of hot glue where I felt like it wasn't completely flat or smooth in places that it should be. I then painted it using the exact same painting technique as before. Gray paint completely dried, followed by dry brushing on pewter paint, black paint, pewter paint in that order. And once that was done, I felt that it looked good enough that I sealed it with matte Mod Podge. So just a coat of matte Mod Podge over the entire surface, except of course the glass. Now for this one, instead of using the black twine, I found this 18 gauge steel wire. And I would recommend using a wire that's easier to bend. This is some pretty sturdy wire, and I had bought some very inexpensive wire that looked very similar to this, but that broke really easily and bent really easily. And I had bought it hoping to use it in my yard, but it wasn't strong enough, and then I think I gave it to Mr. Crafts the Charm for a project of his, so I don't have it anymore. But it was inexpensive. I can't remember if it was tin wire. Does that make sense? I can't remember what it was, so I got it at Home Depot. And I would recommend that for this because this doesn't need to have strength, and this steel wire is a little hard to bend, but it looks so much better than the black twine because it matches the galvanized steel look of the little lantern. So this is what I used to wrap around the glass. Now the advantage to this is it holds its shape, so I just wrapped it around the glass and I didn't need to secure it with any hot glue at all. Now I'm happy enough with this prototype that I'm going to make all of my little lanterns. And wouldn't it be nice if it had occurred to me to put a hole in the bottom of this one? I actually did put a hole in the bottom of the very first prototype that I made, because I want to insert lights in it. If I'm going to put it on a tree and I'm going to have lights on the tree, wouldn't it be cool if the little lantern lit up? So you can see that I've made myself a whole bunch of little flip-flop lantern bottoms, and what I'm going to do is just drill a hole, and I think I'm using a 1/4 inch drill bit here. It's the largest one I have in this little case, and I'm going to drill a hole in the bottom of all of these so that I can insert lights in, hopefully. And when I put the piece of craft foam at the bottom, I can just easily cut a hole out of the craft foam with scissors. I don't need the drill for that. And I was brave and I did also drill a hole in my prototype, and you can see how it looks with the light inserted. I think it's very successful. So once I had this process all figured out with this prototype, it was very easy to make a lot of little lamps in a sort of assembly line style here. Now, one of the main differences is that I really did want those little holes around the top. So I drilled little holes in those top pieces. But I will say, when I painted them, the holes got filled in. And so I ended up just painting the holes on. Even though there were holes there, you couldn't see them. So I just put a little dot of paint with a toothpick to make it look like there were holes. Now, very quickly, just in case you're thinking, I think that I want to make these out of Model Magic. Well, maybe you'll have more success than I did. But the very first one that I made out of my own homemade air dry clay, which would be similar to Model Magic. And maybe real Model Magic would work better. But you can see sort of the process I went through here, and it wasn't super successful. And I made a bunch of them too, and I threw them all away. So if you're wondering, or maybe you've guessed why I called this channel Crafts the Charm, yes, it is partly because I think making your own decor, making your own personal items is charming. It adds charm to a space. But it's also because I'm usually trying to make something that I've never seen anybody make before, at least not exactly the thing that I'm making. And sometimes it's several different tries, sometimes 3 tries, before I come up with something that works. So it's a sort of a, well, it's the 3rd time the charm. And in this case, the first one was the terrible Model Magic ones that I threw away. The second one was made of the craft foam pieces, but the shape wasn't right and it was ugly. And the third one was when I finally really got a lantern that looked pretty much like a lantern, close enough from a distance. And then the 4th one included the hole in the bottom and the hook on top. Now for the top of the new ones, I just made a hook and then filled in the top with hot glue, and that holds the hook in place. And here's what they look like on a tree with the lights inside them lit up. And then I thought you would also like to see what they look like not lit up so that you can see them a little better.
So what did you think of our mining lanterns? After I finally figured out the best way to make them, I had a lot of fun making them, and I really like the way they look on the tree. Please stay tuned for our next ornament, which is coming very soon. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. That lets me know that this is the sort of content that you enjoy viewing. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.